I'll start the recording here. I'll just go through who we are. China Miéville, famed novelist, provocateur, toupee model, whatever you like. Richard Seymour, it's the first time I've talked to you. Again, a writer of quite a few very troubling books, I have to say. I think I made the mistake of reading The Twittering Machine, and then reading Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. And reading these two books back to back is not actually a recipe for a good state of mind, you know.
Yeah.
But and The Disenchanted Earth, that's one of yours I've read. I'm trying to think what else. American Insurgents.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's the first thing of yours I think I read, and I liked your book on Christopher Hitchens too.
Yeah.
There's a vexed history there. I mean, but
there is.
Well,
yes.
So welcome. It's good to see you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I don't know if we have anything. We could stop now. We've had our meetings, but I think the thing we agreed to talk about first was, strangely enough, style, prose style, written style, the politics of style. As Richard and I have both written articles on this, and China, of course, is well known for a certain, how can I put it, opulence. What do you call it? Flamboyance.
I was once called a dandy stylist, which I
good. So I've been called that so often that I'm thinking of making it one of my legal names. So, that was where we left off last time, agreeing with that. This was the topic we didn't get to last time China and I spoke.
Yeah.
Well,
the thing that I remember, I watched your discussion with Ed Simon and found it. I mean, it was a great discussion, and I was already aware of his piece, Punic Encomium, and one of the things that struck me was that a lot of your conversation there sort of went into this discussion about the kind of reflexive hostility in a lot of quarters to, fill in your favorite adjective here, dandy style, opulent style, purple prose, whatever you want to call it. And on the one hand, as people, I think all of us actually, who have been regularly accused of writing, quote, deliberately obfuscatory style, or, deliberately obscurantistly, or, too complicated or too purple. There's a great liberation.
Too aesthetic. I mean, just the self-indulgence of aesthetes
right. Yeah. Decadent, breaching the Orwellian code of clear glass language. And so there is, I mean, I could talk for, I could sort of do a kind of talk for hours about the relief of like something of a kind of kickback against that. And I think we should talk about that. But one thing I wanted to do, rather than just sort of have a sort of self-help group for dandy stylists, I wanted to see about sort of trying to approach this with a degree of generosity and charity towards the critics, and to say, it's very easy and often very reasonable to get very irritated with certain bad faith and or unthinking criticisms of certain kinds of prose, but I don't want to kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater. And there are, particularly if you're trying to write with a political inflection, as Richard and I and also you, David, often are, the criticism that comes up sometimes from people who are, comrades, so to speak, or people who are broadly politically sympathetic, that this pushes people away, that this is not in some sense accessible, that this is, too obscurantist for the masses, all in heavy scare quotes. I want to see how much of that particular kind of critique we can sort of generously allow. Like what has traction about that? Because I don't just want to be defensive about, you can write how you like, there's a true beauty to aestheticism and style, all of which I think, but maybe start by sort of prodding my own nostrums.
I mean, one thing that won't fly at all is the class-based guilt that is deployed. Frequently, this is something that's alienating the working class. Well, I mean, that's not going to fly with me because that's where I come from. And one of the points that I would make is that there's a certain type of, in support of your sort of charitable disposition, China, is there's a certain type of, I would say, scholarly writing, which I can see is quite addictive when you're into it. It feels quite sober and specialized. There's a certain code involved, but it's also incredibly well, I would say the idiom that's used, the vernacular, doesn't have any of the saving benefits of aesthetic grace. And by and large, it's quite mannered in style.
Yeah.
And so there's a version of that type of writing that is, I would say, kind of alienating and unnecessarily so. But I think that fundamentally the problem that people have, and China, this, that the kinds of people who are critical in this fashion, generally speaking, are critical on behalf of other people. They don't claim not to have understood the writing themselves. They're concerned about some others, and also that the kinds of people who make this criticism, by and large, are quite well educated, and there's no basis for them to complain that they haven't heard of a particular word, as though a Google search weren't 2 seconds away, or as though they don't have the resources to figure this stuff out. But yes, I mean, there is always danger that you can let the sheer texture of the writing overtake the purpose, and indeed get in the way of the purpose. There's always that sort of danger. And when people complain about pretentiousness, well, on the one hand, that's a way of describing a stretching forth towards the world, pretension, pretender. But on the other hand, of course, there's pretentiousness. I think we've all encountered versions of that, which is quite obnoxious and irritating, which I think would be a kind of writing that hasn't used the language well, that hasn't earned its extravagance and excesses. I think that would be where I would draw the line, perhaps. That would be a starting point anyway.
Well, I think that, of course, I have to make the distinction between a style of prose that allows itself certain graces, as it would have been called in the 18th century, or certain conceits, trying to balance the concise and the elaborate, trying to be aphoristic, but at times lush, from the genuinely obscurantist habits that academic writing can instill in one. A lot of the critics I've had of my prose over the years haven't been persons of, claiming that it was alienating, the working class. There's a strange notion that the truth is you find people who have a rather sophisticated grasp of language in every, in every fixed stratum of society. It's never been my experience, but I do get criticism sometimes from academics, fellow academics, for making a philosophical argument, say, in a way that's too literary. Now, generally, I take this to mean making it a way, writing it in a way they couldn't, but that's just my pride speaking. But what's odd about this is that the sort of style promoted in many of the, say, in Anglophone philosophy, on the one hand, there's a myth of analytic clarity, analytic purity, but the actual performance of analytic philosophy is anything but that. As a rule, it's a constant retreat into a very arcane jargon, often embroidered with needless passages of logical notation. And so it's, that sort of obscurity, actually, I do have my own prejudice against there. I think that most philosophy can be put in ordinary language. It needn't be put in journalese, but it can be put in an ordinary language that would make clear quite often that the argument being made isn't really all that obscure or difficult. And so I'm very sympathetic to that sort of criticism. But the other one, which you're right about, tends to come not from persons who feel alienated so much as persons who feel they have to speak for those who should feel alienated by your prose. There, my sympathies, vanish pretty quickly, because I'm more worried at present about something I've seen in my undergraduates over the years, and I haven't taught for the past 3 or 4 years, so 5 maybe, so it may be getting worse, is that the ability just to read is in terrific decline. It really is. The ability to read, to be able to write continuous prose, to be able to fill out a blue book in an exam. And I think that this also, of course, is a problem for the ability to think. And it's actually one of the things that, Richard, your book, The Twittering Machine, something that came up again and again in my thoughts as a sort of ancillary thought, is that one of the, obviously the pernicious realities of the kind of virtual culture and the media and social media culture of our time is it really does encourage fragmentation of consciousness, and does so through fragmentation of language and from brutal oversimplification, but then a kind of not just oversimplification, reducing language itself to a kind of code, using emojis and strange abbreviations. And it's not that I think there's some great conspiracy out there, but I have just at the practical level seen a real cognitive, so not just an aesthetic, not just a temperamental, not just a problem with shifting sensibilities, but a real cognitive damage done among people under a certain age, who now you give them a blue book. When I was an undergraduate, 3-hour exam, you filled out 3 or 4 of these things. Now, the students struggle to answer, to fill out a page in one of them in the course of an hour, 3 pages in the course of 3, and those are my chief anxieties. Now that has nothing to do with, and this is the last thing I'll say about this is, with Orwell, for instance, on the one hand, you appreciate the moral impulse behind that famous article, Politics in the English Language, because he was struggling against the obscurantism that politicians use to say nothing whenever it's convenient to say nothing. But on the other hand, there's a kind of Little Englandism too in that essay that suggests that everything is a matter of class prejudice or foreign fanciness if it isn't the sort of plain common man's English. And that too I have problems with for a different set of reasons. But my chief anxiety at present is the resistance to anything simpler than short declarative sentences separated by regular bullet points as being somehow overly wrought and elitist, goes hand in hand with a kind of general deadening of and deadening of the power to think in extended periods and in complicated ways.
I think that's right. And but the part of what's going on there is there's a fear of when you describe being criticized for your overly literary style and making philosophical arguments, there's obviously a fear of seduction there. There's a fear that you'll get carried away by the beauty of it. Well, I think you described some of this in The Beauty of the Infinite, in terms of the fear that beauty itself is an act of will to power, aggression. So there's a sense of that. That's one side of it. But I agree with you about the generally decomposing effects of the new systems of writing we have, the social industry, various chatbots and so on, where essentially the capacity to write is it's broken down into the most mundane but effectively charged units in order to rivet attention. If this isn't an abuse of the Indian philosophy, sort of rivet streams of chitta, to essentially to keep you riveted to the most current thing in the most contracted form, and undercutting not only the capacity for critical reflection that requires that you take a step back from that, but also the capacity for sustained attention, and that means that the writing that we get, I think, there are bigger causes than just the social industry. Obviously, there's the whole pattern of journalism, wherein essentially, I know several people who are employed like this, who are paid to rewrite press releases or to rewrite articles that have appeared in other newspapers, and to do it quickly, as fast as possible. So there's no real attention to what's being written or thought. There's no thought going on behind it. And so you're just being battered with content whose sole effect, or his intended effect, is somatic. It's to get you agitated, and to get you to exist in a conscious state of anxiety, and these jittery intervals wherein all you can do is cathartically bang out responses on the social industry. On the plus side, if there is, if we can give attention to the plus sides, it does lend itself to a certain kind of witticism, and sparkiness and brightness. But on the other side, it's quite a detached way of living, and thus of writing. China, you're waiting to say.
Yeah, sorry, the weird motions I'm making is because my cat is so again in this to be generous, I think it's worth saying, although overwhelmingly I think in the cases that Richard and I have faced of criticism, often inflected in a very moralistic socialist way, it is on behalf of other people, or sometimes performatively using oneself as a kind of stand-in for other people. So I don't understand this. I'm off down the pub to do some real politicking. But I do think it's important to stress that there are genuinely people, I think, who completely in good faith open something that they're really interested in and bounce off the text, and are, I think what interests me is, rather than bouncing off the text and being provoked into fascination, or being moved by reading a sentence that you don't necessarily understand. But Richard, you've talked very beautifully about the political and aesthetically radicalizing effect as a young working class kid, precisely of reading things that you didn't understand, and knowing that this was going to be an effort to do this, and the idea that something which does not, it's a phrase that you quote a lot, Richard, from writing about Prynne's poetry, this phrase of tendentious obscurity, and that's, if you like, the telos of this kind of writing. But any writing that withdraws a little bit, that uses its own form as part of the way of imparting its message, and so that therefore that isn't necessarily sure of its own message, that therefore requires effort. I think people are very, I think two things happen. One is there is a sort of, there's a kind of exhaustion. People are exhausted, effort is difficult, and reading is perceived of as a kind of leisure activity, which of course it can be. No one is the cops here. But also, I think particularly with people who haven't grown up in a certain cultural milieu and or class milieu, there is a very strong and completely comprehensible sense that some bastards out there are trying to put something over on you, that if you don't understand this, this is because something is being done to you. And this is reasonable, because that is indeed what is done all the time. Yeah. And I think that I think that the thing about what I would think of, because again, just to say, none of us here have ever said that there's no such thing as beautiful, wonderful, clear and precise writing. All we're saying is there is also a space for the more exploratory, rococo, etc., etc. I think sometimes people who aren't, if you like, sort of habituated to that kind of effort and that kind of joy in uncertainty, and the liberation of the effort, I think they have a sense that there's a cadre of people out there for whom this is immediately obvious, and it's a code. And what this prose is doing is that it's being a border guard to keep you from getting inside the club. And I think that is a fallacy, because in fact, if you look at the prose that most of the people who are indeed trying to put people over for like reasons of class exploitation or oppression on other people use, it is deadeningly precise in a kind, it's the langue de bois. It is emotive in a very shallow way, whether you look at fascist literature or whether you look at kind of Blairite quote accessible prose. So if I have a judgment that someone who is criticizing this kind of prose is doing so in this genuine good faith, my attitude would be to sort of say, this is not a velvet curtain to keep you out. This is an invitation to a certain kind of journey. And no one's saying it won't be effortful, but the point is that the effort, if it's done well, is more than worth it.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I also, would point out that actually those, as you say, those whose agenda really are to, hide deeper motives behind beguiling lies aren't, as a rule, are not going to resort to the sort of language, the kind of elliptical tropes or whatever that depend on subtlety. It's more sloganeering. The kind of the most brutally, intentionally deceptive address made to create a false impression usually is made by someone who's mastered the art of simple, jagged, seemingly meaningful but ultimately vacuous rhetoric. I mean, this is how Donald Trump, of course, functions. I mean, he's a half-wit and all that, but he has a strange ability, in part because of his own lack of verbal gifts. His own deficiencies have been honed into a rather dangerous weapon. There are persons who can respond to me. He's very good at saying nothing with a brutal terseness that somehow seems emotively meaningful to a lot of people. I go back and forth on this issue. I mean, again, I also think that there's a kind of academic obscurantism that really is deplorable, that is unnecessary, and that is not a matter of class, but a matter of guild privilege and so on. That said, for myself, I'll ask the two of you to comment on this. I mean, for myself, I find it increasingly hard to know what the acceptable floor is. I mean, as you say, China, that you have to, if you're trying to make, there's some arguments that cannot, or there's some content, it doesn't have to be an argument, it can be, a story, that can't be reduced to a set of simple propositions. And you have to invite people to make the effort to understand, just as you're making an effort to express something that perhaps cannot be expressed overly reductively. But it's also the case that for myself, I know that I'm capable of communicating only at certain levels, right? You've both read The Experience of God. I tend to think that, to my mind, that's about the best I can do at trying to reach a larger audience than the academic one, if with difficult ideas. I don't mean that I couldn't, but with ideas that take some effort to. But I mean, I've had people write to me quite earnestly and saying that they felt left out of the conversation, that I could have expressed myself in simpler terms, and that the topics the book addresses fascinate them, but that they themselves find the book menacingly difficult in some regards, and something they couldn't share with friends. I've had the same response to That All Shall Be Saved. Again, a book that, from my perspective, is an attempt to deal with a fairly complicated 7-part argument in what I take to be ordinary prose. And I think that's getting worse now. I think it was 1979, I think Christopher Lasch, I think it was 79, The Culture of Narcissism was a bestseller. Very few persons at the time who complained that it was an obscure text. I think today it couldn't possibly be a bestseller, or if it were, it would be like one of those Daniel Dennett volumes that's a bestseller because people feel they need it on the shelf in the back of their Zoom conversations. But because no one's actually read, I have, but I mean, most people aren't actually going to sit down and read from Bacteria to Bach, but it'll sell well because it's and again, it's trying to find that medium. I do worry about that we see that I don't want to be complicit in the further degradation of discourse, making it almost impossible to say anything that requires some effort on the reader's part to think it through with you.
I think that the point you made, David, about the fact that you are sometimes criticized by academics for an excessively, quote, literary style. Can we just assume there are scare quotes around almost every adjective any of us use for the moment?
No, I think you have to have your fingers like this at all times.
Okay. Well, I do, but otherwise you can't see it in the backdrop.
Understand, right?
I think that's a really important and interesting point because, as you say, that's more kind of guild privilege than class in a way. But again, those people who in good faith feel pushed out by a certain kind of literary prose, I think often feel that they're being excluded from the academy. And of course, the thing is, plenty of people are excluded from the academy, and that's an appalling thing. But not like that. And I think that your anecdote's really useful in that way. And I think that one of the things that interests me is, like, I think that this is worse, I think, in the States than Britain, although it's not great here. When you look at the ways of doing academic writing, there is not only is there that very kind of plodding and indeed sort of genuinely obscurantist style that is spawned by a certain kind of specialization and so on, but also I can construct, like, I hate Harvard in-text referencing almost more than I think it is an absolute abomination. And part of and I genuinely think there's a political point here, because what it does is it destroys the rhythm and music of a line, because your eyes are constantly broken from the rhythm and music of a line by these references. And it bespeaks this hideous instrumentalization of language, which likes to think of itself as common sense, as a kind of articulation of the Orwell idea of clear glass, and actively creates an ugly reading experience, and is also philosophically incoherent about what language actually is. And I think to answer to address this to your question, David, like, this notion that if you're writing, you have to be writing, there's an implication that you're failing in a duty if a certain number of people or certain people or whatever have difficulty with something at a particular point. And I feel like all any of us can do is write for the version of us who wants to read this particular book. and who will enjoy that. And we have to just take a wager that that there is enough of an audience that are made up of the us who want to know about this particular topic, that the book will find a readership. And part of the thing I end up saying is, like, if I did my absolute best, I absolutely never tried to make it unnecessarily obscure. I tried to express it as well as possible. And if you don't like that and the effort is alienating, then I'm genuinely and sincerely sorry. But then maybe I'm not the writer for you. There are other writers out there. And one of the points about this debate should be, there is no one right way to write style. If you keep bouncing off David Bentley Hart, it maybe read other people until another time when things will have shifted for whatever reasons, and you're ready to come to David Bentley Hart. We all have those writers we're not in the right place for at this time. That's okay.
That's a really common experience for me, finding a writer who looks interesting, possibly, but I just can't get into it. And then a few years down the line, suddenly it makes sense. And I think that's as good a response as any. And obviously, we can't all write for the same audience, and we can't all intend to reach the broadest possible audience, and some subjects are not necessarily for the broadest possible audience. One thing I would say about Trump, and I know China agrees on this, is that I think he evinces a strange kind of poetic diction. For example, recently in a speech, he among his statements, he built up this rhythm where he said, "I am your shield, I am your warrior, I am your retribution." Now that's such a polysemic term, because essentially there are so many people who feel screwed over, who feel hard done by, whether correctly or not, frequently incorrectly, or feel hard done by for the wrong reasons. And that is just a beautifully condensed poetic statement of what you feel you need. You need somebody to be your retribution. Well, William Connolly talks about the underground currents of existential revenge in daily life. I think that Trump is a past master at leveraging those. Bannon's previous speech that he wrote for Trump about referencing American carnage. These are not. I think there's a kind of idiot savant capacity in Trump, but the far right is very good at this kind of fascistic poetry. I don't know a better term for it. Whereas with the China, you were talking about the texture of Blairite prose. The modus operandi of clarity in this sense, when you actually break it down, they've used fairly simple language, and they've said apparently straightforward things, but when you look at it and break it down, it doesn't actually ever make sense. It doesn't actually ever cohere, and it has the feel of advertising copy. And I think that the sense in which people have come to think that it's a matter of intellectual honor to think and write like this, and that anything else is giving in, a capitulation to the self-indulgence, the unreasoning, verbosity, and so on and so on, is obviously quite problematic. But to be honest with you, what I found is that in different books or different idioms, I'm trying to speak to a different audience. So with something like the Twittering machine, I intended it for a wider audience, but slightly literate audience than, say, the book about Corbyn, which was for a very political audience, and so on. So, I mean, I think that there are legitimate complaints about the way in which style can be obfuscatory, but there is also a sense in which it's quite reasonable to say that reading is, you're not swallowing a glass of juice or something. You're not just consuming something. You're doing work, and the work is part of what the writing is about. It's part of what's going to make you into something a bit different than you were before.
I think that's right. As a thing, you mentioned earlier the issue of the seductions of beauty.
Yeah.
And that is a temptation, I have to admit. I mean, I know that I have certain rhetorical gifts on the page, and that sometimes it's tempting to try to use that as a kind of main force to carry the day, when it's too tedious to make all the proper steps in an argument or an exposition, or, actually, I have an essay on the nature of tragedy and theology that's oddly concerned with this, which I happened to notice when I reread it recently was one of my most self-indulgent rhetorical displays. On the one hand, I'm talking about the way in which the tragic theater could at times aestheticize and glamorize. It was almost a Brechtian point. Certain things that ought not to be, and that is as much of a petty aesthete as I am, I recognize the moral danger of trying to assimilate, of trying to take the tragic as a hermeneutic of injustice, because the tragic, as often as not, will allow us to discharge whatever passions we have regarding injustice within this sort of ceremonial space, and then once it's discharged there, it's we feel we're quite fine, sensitive souls, but we don't do much once we step outside the theater. So I mean, I think there is that danger. I'm writing, I'm finishing up the manuscript on philosophy of mind for Yale. And unlike the passages on philosophy of mind in the book, in Experience of God, here I've written it as a Socratic dialogue, precisely not to allow myself precisely to forbid myself from allowing my voice simply to try to overwhelm objections. I mean, I try to put the objections to the arguments I'm making and give them honest airing in the other characters in the dialogue. And it's and even that's hard to do. So, I mean, it has been instructive to me, to realize that as much as I want to rail against those who complain about an overly literate style, it's not as if I'm entirely insensible to their complaints. That said, at the end of the day, my chief anxiety still remains that we are raising up generations of young people who've been deprived of the not just the literary pleasure of reading good prose, but of the cognitive and discriminative and intuitive capacities that this endows them with as they age. I mean, honestly, I sometimes think of my students, well, if you'd grown up, just to say as I did, just like reading Robert Louis Stevenson, not reading philosophy, just reading continuously well-wrought prose, it would be easier for you now than it is. But having been raised really basically on one of these things, there's my dog, he's sort of there. I see there a kind of a sort of mental pliancy and a kind of spiritual pliancy being created that and maybe it's just because I'm old and you always think the next generation is going to hell in a handbasket, but I find it genuinely sinister, the degree to which our habits and what seems like even just a natural resistance, perhaps to an overly complex sentence, may actually point to a deeper pathology of the present moment, in which it's becoming too much of a burden for everybody to engage in continuous discourse or continuous thought. And that's why I'm genuinely terrified of this sort of new chatbot technology. I don't know if it's going to be like Skynet and take over the world and kill us all. I mean, that's not my principle. Is that I see it just as accelerating a kind of assimilation of all of our human activity, our human consciousness, our human interactions into the structure of this economic, cultural, leveling virtual space, this virtual regime of late modern capital that is so effectively that paths of resistance, real resistance, as opposed to convulsions of discontent, become ever more difficult. Just being able to think your way past the spectacle of the moment it seems to me becoming increasingly hard for persons who've been raised or persons who've grown up in this environment of fragmentary, instantaneous, never substantial, never continuous communication. And that wasn't the way I thought of the internet when it first appeared. I thought, well, maybe this, people have to write and read. This isn't like television. Maybe actually there's something hopeful here. But I was thinking, in a rather old-fashioned way, that people were going to sit down at their computers like Anthony Trollope, spend hours. It's just not really how the technology has worked out. That's not what the algorithms do. I could never have dreamt in those days of these algorithms that social media uses in order to make your consciousness fall into the pathway. Speaking of which, last thing I'll say on this. You were right in your use of the streams of chitta. And I'll just point out that in Christian tradition, or Vagrius Ponticus, this would be streams of logismi or logismoi, the way in which thought can be captured in streams of trivial association and diverted constantly from concentration. It's I say, in some sense, I think of of social media and the internet as we're constructing them now, and chatbots especially, as machines of logismi.
That's a good term, actually. I think that would be a good essay title. Can I just say, I mean, there's a danger that we will end up scapegoating the technology. And I just want to say, in terms of the declining, if you want to call it cognitive capacities, sustained attention, etc., that I really think education policy has got as much to do with this as anything else. I don't know how bad it is in the US,
Horrible.
but in this country,
it's horrible. Education policy is always horrible in the US. Yeah.
Well, I think particularly to do with the neoliberal reorientation of education around the idea of reducing it to testable slabs of knowledge, and particularly when it comes to literacy, this is catastrophic. So that when you're, asking English students to comment on a story, they are asked to comment on things that can be tested, nouns, pronouns, adjectives, and so on, without any real engagement with the meaning of the story and any historicization. China, am I wrong about this? I mean, this seems to be the trend for the last 30, 40 years. And I just mean to say that, in a similar way, when we talk about what's happening to online information or disinformation, I think ecologies of disinfotainment have been evolving through the fusion of news media with celebrity culture, with PR and so on for decades. Cable news was obviously a big step in this direction. And so we're just seeing, new iterations and obviously, I think more dangerous iterations of it now. I think that when it comes to what's going to happen with the chatbot and so on, it's interesting. People want it to be a form of consciousness. Manifestly, you see this everywhere. The joke is, I've talked to this robot and it's given me a stupid reply, or previously there was a great deal of excitement around a bot that was produced by Microsoft called Tay Tweets, which I don't know if you recall it, but it ended up producing a lot of Nazi, pornographic, racist material because it was simply programmed to take stuff off the internet, whatever was there, and to regurgitate it in, semi-coherent linguistic patterns. but the fantasy is that that this will be a conscious partner for you, and that's quite sinister to me, because actually, as Benjamin Bratton puts it somewhere, every computer program is a political program. It's always a congealed purpose. So somebody has designed this with an intentionality, and whatever consciousness, so-called, this machine has is derivative of the consciousness of the people, first of all, who designed it, and secondarily, and only secondarily, those who use it. So the problem then is that you end up having your attention, your consciousness, your intentions being reformatted and reorganized around the intentions of the designers, who I don't know what's going to happen with chatbots specifically, but by and large, these technologies have been designed to really atomize us a great deal more, but not only atomize us in the sense of individuating, but to break us up. Philip Mirowski makes the point somewhere that neoliberals really don't believe in a self. And I know not everything is about neoliberalism, but it is relevant here. They really don't believe in the self. They believe in the ontology of the enterprise. Everything is just a series of enterprises put into operation to generate a return. Everything about you is various streams of capital, cognitive capital, muscular capital, and so on. And so you on the internet are just various enterprises. You've got your Twitter account, your Instagram account, your 2 Facebook accounts, all the rest of it. And they're all doing something different for you. They're all your online icons, and they're all your businesses. So that essentially you are being made into something else, something that in one sense is quite narcissistic in the sort of in a narrow sense of that term, but in another sense have no stable reference for yourself. I think there's one of the problems there, and also it's increasingly breaking down, I think, the capacity to engage in sustained critical reflection on anything, because there's always a new pulse of excitement, and everything is designed to crest around pulses of excitement. There's always a new hashtag storm or something to get worked up about. There's always a new bad guy on the internet too. Somebody has said something that breaches social mores, whether you're on the left or right, doesn't really matter. And we're going to go hunting for this person for today. Tomorrow we'll forget all about it, and we'll forget the amount of sadism dressed up as virtue that was involved in that. I find all that profoundly worrying, and it's what's most disastrous about it to me is that it takes the abstractive possibilities of writing and turns it against us. Exactly as you said, David, when the internet comes along, you think there is possibility for a real literate culture and a potentially insurgent culture, and there was an element of that before the social industry came along. It's important to remember there was a kind of left online culture that was dedicated to not the mall, not the agora in that sense, but to sharing free stuff, conversation, all of that. And it wasn't only the fascistic element that was using this, like Stormfront and all the rest of it. There was a genuine left cyber culture that was quickly appropriated. It's interesting that Twitter's origins was in an app that was designed for activists who were protesting outside Republican Democratic conventions in 2004. It was designed to help them evade police persecution, because essentially, if you could have a communication system wherein people could, it'd be like texting, but among a larger group of people, and people could share information without any one person being head of communications, who could be arrested and then destroy the coordination for the whole group. That was what the design of the app was for. It was called TextMob. Within a year or so, one of the founders of or designers of TextMob was working for Odeo, which is a firm that later became Twitter. And they did a presentation about the app. Twitter bosses listened to it, and they're like, wow, imagine there was an app that was like texting but among a bigger group of people, or like in public. And they used many of the same protocols. How much of that was deliberate, I don't know. And then, of course, they leveraged the sort of popular uprisings in 2010, 2011, the Green Movement in Iran, the Egyptian uprising against Mubarak, the so-called Arab Spring, Occupy, and all the rest of it, to make their name. In other words, there were these emancipatory currents. It was all there, and there was a potential for that culture, and it's been completely well, I don't want to be apocalyptic about this. It's been to a large extent shut down or co-opted or commodified, and to the extent that if one must use the social industry now, I would say, and these sort of related industries, I would say that one should have the same relationship to it as one would have to Fox News. You might have to talk to Fox News or the Murdoch press in order to make your case to somebody, but you don't go blabbing your secrets, and don't go using it as a crutch for friendship or emotional support. Be very disciplined about how you use these devices, because ultimately they're using you.
I mean, this is, you said, David, about, maybe it's just because we're all getting old, but, and I think, yes, there's an element of that. And I think certainly myself, whenever I do feel these kind of Jeremiads, I try to walk a middle line between absolutely sincerely inhabiting them and sort of testing them and probing them and so on, but also trying to kind of, through that process of testing and probing, sort of thinking of countervailing tendencies. So, whether it's a sort of a negative, like not everything that happens online is terrible, or whether it's a positive, like, there are certain, as Richard said, sort of iterations of a certain kind of witticism that I think has sprung up through internet speak that is genuinely witty and genuinely funny, and a new kind of literary creativity. So I don't want to have the sense that like this is all unilinear. There are a thousand sort of contradictory pulls, but at the same time, I think in terms of, I know we might talk a bit about materialism later, but one sense in which I'm very kind of classically, historically materialist is that while there are very real centers of gravity and sort of tractions and tendencies within all of the forms and all of the new technologies, they are as nothing to the underlying social and economic forces that are pushing them. So the reason I'm feeling very bleak about AI is not because I think AI is in and of itself, a terrible thing. It's because it is being developed by immensely powerful, utterly sociopathic capitalist concerns. And I think part of and I don't just mean that therefore all the kind of, good people have these big, these big conglomerates against them, but also it's happening in the context of the sort of atomized neoliberal, or if you want to be generous, post-neoliberal subject, who is, as we all are to varying degrees and in various ways, constrained and ruined and traumatized by these things that have thrown up. So in a way, like the chatbot that you were talking about, Richard, like AI, all the new AIs, and we can take a moment to reflect, like as Cory Doctorow says, about what an absolutely both stupid and ideological term artificial intelligence is, but let's use it for now. They're all just more and more and more sophisticated versions of the same things, so that they're taking, as Ted Chiang puts it, taking blurry pictures of the internet, and you look at them from afar. But the people on the internet are the people who've been brought up under this system. So it's no wonder that certain tendencies are going to be the peaks and troughs that get averaged out to create the particular sort of chatbot voice, if you like, the particular AI voice. That's nothing inherent to AI as a phenomenon. It may very well be inherent to the growing tendency of AI under senescent and predatory capitalism. And I think also, as you were saying, well, both of you actually, this thing about wanting it to be a mind, this is part of that subjectivity, is this kind of awed inability to pick apart the various elements of what is going on here. So the way it feels to me, there are at least three axes on which we need to talk about, what Emily Bender calls the stochastic parrots, of the sort of AI generated voice. One is the question of whether or not it's important. One is the question of whether or not it's, broadly speaking, good versus evil. And the other is whether or not it's a mind. So, or a nascent mind. And the problem is, because there's this incredible hype, and because there are exactly these flows of affect and excitement and somatic engagement that you're talking about, Richard, these all get conflated. So it's kind of like, AI, yes or no? And it's like, well, what? So I think that these moves are tremendously important, currently trending much more towards evil than good, and in no way a nascent mind at all. And it's a completely preposterous thing to suggest otherwise. And the problem, and we have to be able to pick these apart. And there's a danger of sort of saying, if you want to argue, of course, this isn't a growing intelligence, a conscious mind of any kind, because everything gets thrown in together. You sometimes sort of find yourself saying, and this is a flash in the pan that isn't going to have any big impact. And, it's like, that doesn't follow at all. I suspect this is going to be extremely bad for a lot of people, particularly, waged workers. But that doesn't mean that it's a growing, Skynet overlord. We've got to be able to talk about it in its different components. And all of these components and the way they both get separated and collapsed are themselves ideological functions.
Well, of course, you both know that I think the whole computation, the notion that computation and thinking are analogous to one another is just a twofold misprision anyway. Obviously, I think we're such a clever species that we can impress ourselves, the image of ourselves, the echo of ourselves on our environment so pervasively that, we become like Narcissus looking at our reflection in a pool. We're tempted to think that what we're looking at really is another agency. And with computers, of course, because it accelerates. And I mean, it's technically speaking, there's nothing a computer can do that couldn't be accomplished by Charles Babbage's machine, his thinking machine from the 19th century. It might take millennia for it to accomplish certain of the functions that a computer now does in seconds. But nonetheless, we do create the powerful illusion that what's going on in the computer actually has the semiotic content of our own intentions and our own consciousness, whereas in fact, but then what has happened, of course, in our time, which I find rather sinister, but for some reason, and this will bring us to the issue of materialism, I think, fairly easily, is the desire then to sort of reverse Narcissus's error and imagine ourselves instead to be the reflection. And so we get these computational models of mind based on functionalism that, when you break them down, are incoherent. They're based on a notion of what thought is. They completely have to omit the possibility of real consciousness, real intentionality. A very good book to read. I could always point towards Daniel Dennett, but if you want an almost reductio ad absurdum case by an otherwise talented philosopher, there was a book by Alex Rosenberg about a dozen years ago called An Atheist's Guide to Life, or whatever it is, in which he laid out at extraordinary length very good arguments for why no physical system can be have intrinsic intentionality. Now, I think that most sensible persons, and this is, again, why the obscurantism of academic jargon is something to struggle against, because it encourages people to think that their common sense intuitions are just stupid or don't rise to the level of a rational argument. Our common sense intuition tells us that, that intentionality is obviously real. We're using language, and presumably because we believe we're communicating, and we do things because we have purposes. The consciousness is real. But Rosenberg's conclusion is just the opposite, because physics alone fixes the facts of reality, because intentionality can't possibly reside in the physical system as physical. Therefore, intrinsic intentionality doesn't exist. And all right, on the one hand, this is just a kind of radical materialism that's sort of conflated the projects of mechanistic philosophy and Enlightenment skepticism and come up with a very odd confection indeed. But it has a sinister kind of political and social and cultural dimension as well. I mean, it really is a kind of, so to speak, there's a, no, I won't say suppressed, because the people who are writing this ideologically may have no intention of the sort, but nonetheless, it's very much part of the use of algorithmic mechanisms to, just in the way that, for instance, in the days of B.F. Skinner, people took behaviorism as a kind of license to think of the human being simply as a kind of complex of stimulus and response that should be manipulated, fixed. Anything that technologizes the human becomes a license to correct the deficiencies of what that we perceive, whether that's, as in the 20th century taught us, whether it's racial technology or an economic technology or a social technology. And so this computational model of mind is more than, it seems to be, just bad philosophy. It's bad philosophy that reflects a pervasive ideology of instrumentality, of instrumentalization of the human for economic ends, principally. And it's and we can defer this issue for a moment. Yeah, I do think that people on the left who become complicit in this kind of mechanistic, reductive, or even eliminativist understanding of consciousness are unaware of the degree to which they're becoming complicit in precisely the kind of instrumentalization of the human that has, in some sense, been the project of late capitalist modernity for some time. Again, not like, I don't mean a conscious project always, although in some cases it is. The people who create these algorithms in social media and Richard's quite right. I mean, it's not just atomization in the sense of individualization. It is treating the human as an assemblage, to misuse Deleuze, of desiring machines. I talked to somebody who works in artificial intelligence at the university here in Notre Dame. And he's quite worried about it. He understands the code. He doesn't for a moment suppose that artificial intelligence actually could become conscious. Because he's just too aware of the code, that the intentionality that you see there is a derivative human intentionality. But what he said is that what they've become very good at in understanding how to use this is that you can treat persons purely in functional terms, even if functionalism is false as an ontology. It's very effective as a technology. And you can aim your algorithm, as he said, you're not aiming your algorithm at a person, you're aiming your algorithm at his amygdala, or at his viscera. And the emerging generation of AI is getting better and better at doing that simply through large language compilation. And I think it is going to be very bad, not because there's a consciousness emerging, but precisely because there isn't one there. And so the deferred intentionalities of the programmers, on the one hand, the worst aspects of them are exceeding now the control of the programmers themselves, and that simulacral intentionality has real consequences. It might as well be conscious and have sinister purposes if it wanted to, but there's no consciousness there to appeal to. There's no conscience. There is simply a deferred intentionality that takes on a kind of uncontrollable life of its own.
One could quite easily read the cultural anxiety about machine consciousness taking over and being a kind of despotic overlord as a kind of disavowed, anguished hope that maybe there's a controlling intelligence in this that precisely might be appealed to, as opposed to this predatory, mindless accumulation that is the current overlord.
I think there's some truth in that, yeah.
The danger, as I see it, is that people, it's in the fact that people want it to be conscious. In other words, you're getting what in the psychoanalytic idiom you just call transference with robots. And this is an old story. It goes back to Eliza in the 1960s. It was a fake Rogerian therapist. People formed emotional relationships, or thought they did, with with this inert program. And it wasn't very sophisticated at all. Now, increasingly, we're finding in the work of Sherry Turkle and others the tendency for adults to prefer to have emotional relationships with robots, where the relationships that they have with others in their lives turn out to be disappointing, because other people are other people. They come with all their bundle of flaws and oddities and so on, the warp and wend of life, and nobody wants that if you can avoid it at all. So you've got a robot that will essentially do some of a purified or streamlined version of some of the functions of a relationship. And there's a worry for me that why, I wonder, are people drawn to that? So that's the first question. And it does seem to me that underlying that there is some basic brokenness, some basic despair. And I think the dating apps are actually leveraging that and making it much, much worse. I mean, everybody I speak to who uses these things these days, it's pure hell. Yeah. So, because first of all, just the idea of matching like with like, as if that's the way love works, as if that's the sort of the way in which people find each other, by being very, very similar to one another in their outward attributes, in terms of their politics and whatever. I mean, it's absurd. It's not how it works. And I think necessarily it brings people to a depressing sort of state where, they regularly don't get on. And they start to despair about ever reaching out to people, particularly in big cities, which are quite atomized anyway. So there's all that. Then, of course, as you say, and I know that you're aware of this, that the Skinnerian behaviorism that you refer to is, in some ways, I don't want to simplify this, but it's part of the model for the social industry. The continuities of sort of behaviorist thinking about addiction in particular, about how do you get people hooked, which, by the way, the idea that there are books written about how to get your consumers hooked, I know this is supposed to be, is badass or whatever, but it's really appallingly sociopathic that you would write
it
about.
Also happens to be really evil. So
yes. Well, this is what I mean. Evil is the correct term. So this is awful. But anyway, the idea of reducing people to inert, mechanistic beings. The problem that bad theory works within certain limits. There's always a limit, because ultimately people aren't like that. There's some sort of form of resistance. I use the idiom of the unconscious in the Lacanian sense to express some of that, but the point is it works up to a point, and to a very dangerous point. There's another way in which you could approach this, which is to say, as some people do, that capitalism, as we understand it, is analogous to a kind of supercomputer. In other words, it's a set of protocols and imperatives that are derivative of consciousness, and that only work because they put consciousness into motion. Somebody has to decide to be a Träger. Somebody has to decide, I'm going to be a capitalist and invest to accumulate. But there's a sense in which it does kind of reduce us. It roboticizes us in some form or other. That's a sort of a speculation too far. Perhaps, but ultimately,
no,
I don't
think it's too far. I think actually that's sort of the implicit project, whether it's a conscious project or not.
Yeah. And yes, I think that then, when we come to the idea of eliminative or reductivist treatments of consciousness, I think I can understand those for whom, because this would have described me until fairly recently, the intellectual honor seems to require you to believe in nothing but a thoroughgoingly physical material universe, and therefore consciousness must be reducible to the patterns of physics in terms of the bottom-up construction of reality and so on. And therefore, although that presents real problems politically, and also just in terms of its obvious dissonance with your underlying political commitments and philosophical commitments, you have to accept it and kind of live with it and not probe into it too much. But there is, I think something profoundly, first of all, apart from the fact that it's just utterly incoherent, this is obviously it will not describe or explain consciousness adequately. And the best we have at the moment is a kind of promissory note that at some point in the future, physicists are going to work this out, which just doesn't seem plausible, simply because consciousness doesn't behave like physical stuff. But also, well, the problem is that in deferring this question, you end up internalizing what I think is the ontology of capitalism, not consciously designed or anything, but there it is, which is precisely that the universe is just a bunch of stuff that happens to be there. It happens to interact in particular ways. There's no purpose to anything. Your human purpose here on the planet essentially is to accumulate as much as you can, enjoy it, and forget about all that stuff about the past and future generations. Forget about any responsibility that you might have to, the animals that we're driving to mass extinction, or to the human beings that are going to suffer tremendously from climate breakdown, all of that sort of stuff. Live in the present, party like it's 1999. That's essentially where you would end up, a profoundly bleak, absurdist, and depressed picture of reality. And that's one I think that suits the tech giants in Silicon Valley very, very well, but maybe not so much the socialist left, I hope.
Well, I mean, that's been my contention for some time. Last time I talked to China, I mentioned that I'm very fond of the early, more romantic Marx, just because I have this strange feeling that as we also discussed last time, I mean, the sort of piecemeal resistance to the notion of gradualism seems ever more implausible. That is, whatever small adjustments you make to the machine or the system or whatever you want to call it, it's more than amply able, the sheer plasticity of those protocols you mentioned, precisely because it's operating in a sense as if it's not dealing with intentional subjects. It's already broken down its functions and the functions of human beings within its economy in a way that's easily manipulable. Is that all of that can be reassumed back into the logic of capitalism and its sort of endless quest to convert the world into numbers. Sort of the sort of reverse diabolical Pythagoreanism of capital is whoever has the most abstract numbers at the end wins. But what I think actually the path of resistance has to, in some sense, have this romantic intonation, an actual openness again to that the mystery of consciousness, the mystery of being, the mystery of the natural world about us, isn't simply an etiological query about a mechanistic arrangement of meaningless things. If we concede that picture of reality, then already the question of what the whole point of the moral pathos of resistance is inevitably raised, but also effective resistance to that, that actually touches on the way consciousness works, the way it slips free of mechanistic control or can do, and the way in which the natural world around us can be understood as a community at once of flesh and consciousness. All of that becomes somehow a language we're not allowed to use, because somehow that's and it's quite often. I mean, this has been my experience. I'm not a Marxist. I know lots of Marxists. I know people of all sorts of political backgrounds. As how many of them do, in fact, conflate their understanding of the 19th century dialectical materialism of their political tradition with the Enlightenment project of more Metri than Kant, and machine with absolute mechanization of our picture of reality, so that materialism becomes a blanket term for any number of intellectual and ontological commitments that not only don't necessarily belong together, but in some sense deeply contradict one another. I mean, this is Richard. For those, Richard recently wrote on just this issue. What kind of materialism? Let me just put it. This is a stupid way of phrasing it, but what kind of materialism we're talking about, or the degree to which what we mean by materialism has become so ambiguous that it's become a confusion. In the circles of you pinkos, I'm just a humble Christian socialist of the old variety. But more and more, I have to say, as I say, because of my sense that gradualism is simply an impossible stance to take. More and more, getting more and more radicalized, I think. But yeah, it was. But that I did want to talk about Richard's article on just this issue, principally because it seems to me a strange thing to conflate the sort of eliminativist materialism of the Churchlands or the Dennets, which is, it's just silly anyway. It's based on a kind of childish notion of the sciences and on an ontology also of causation, in which everything can be reduced to bottom-up causation. And there's no reason to think that even in terms of the strictest empiricism, why things at system level complexity need to be absolutely convertible in their causality with lower level bottom-up causation is simply because people don't want to, because they're afraid of admitting like formal or final causality into the picture, and they think this has something to do with a particular theology. It may do, but it's not necessarily logically entailed. But to conflate that, which is that basically reality is Galileo's realm of velocity, mass, motion, with the kind of materialism that says that there's a rationality to history that is instructive, that history itself can become the matter of rational reflection, and that simply acknowledges that material conditions influence thought, or that there are structures of material reality that limit or to some degree determine structures of thought and action. These are two completely different materialisms that somehow are all too often conflated in the imagination of, well, to be honest, people in your camp. Not you, but that's an accusation I'm pointing at you.
Well, yes, that is partly why we are talking to you. I think we've both been experiencing.
It wasn't really meant as an accusation.
No. I know
this is a setup.
I think. Richard, you tell me if you think I'm being reasonable here. It seems to me that this question of the conflation of different levels of materialism is indeed rife on the Marxist left. And what's interesting about it, if you're someone like me, and I think Richard, who is relatively recently and relatively relatively late in their political life, actually coming to really probe at a lot of these foundational ontological questions, is that you realize that what to some extent I'd sort of taken as a kind of almost a Marxist given is in fact not the case. So what you've got is, for example, you've got a reasonable number of Marxists who are very often, of course, the explicitly Christian Marxists, but also some others, and people like Terry Eagleton. I don't know whether or not he would call himself a Christian, but certainly his Marxism and his Catholicism are fairly inextricable, his Catholic milieu. Who in his book on materialism, really good book, just says very cheerfully in passing, there's absolutely no need to be an atheist if you're a materialist. Metaphysical materialism and historical materialism don't need to be, one does not presume the other, is completely unconcerned by this. And this has just been a kind of quietly bubbling very sort of sensible position, I think, among a certain group of Reds. I think the default position for a lot of Reds is a kind of disquietude at the idea that if you're a materialist, it doesn't, somehow you kind of want to be a metaphysical materialist all the way down, but you don't think about it that much. And I'm not criticizing that. To a lot of the time, you don't need to think about it that much. Not everyone needs to be a professional philosopher. It makes very little difference in a lot of social struggles on the day-to-day, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, I'm not having a go at this. And I think, frankly, this was my position for a very long time, which was essentially you're vaguely aware that the question of consciousness is a bit tricky here. And you read some people, and we talked about this last time, David, and they throw around the word emergence, and you sort of say, okay, that'll do, and you kind of and you basically proceed on that basis. And again, for many of us, for many comrades, for most of the time, fine. I take Richard's point about the kind of dangers of underlying ontologies, and I take them seriously. It's partly why I'm here in this conversation. But I would also want to urge caution, because push that too far, you go down the line of what some Christians say, which is that, it's impossible to be an ethically good atheist, for example, which I know no one in this room is saying, but I would want to push back against the teleological version of that argument.
Yeah.
But if you really start to probe, as for, the reasons of liberating mental crisis that Tad DeLay talks about that have occurred to Richard and I for various reasons, this whole thing starts to get very difficult in the most wonderful way. And one reason I have a kind of soft spot for a certain kind of eliminativism is that in some senses it's like the Marxist obverse of Eagleton. It recognizes that there's a problem. It recognizes that there is a metaphysical problem here, and it insists on the predicates that it has essentially inherited, which is what it thinks materialism is, and then goes all the way down with that. So it has a kind of Jesuitical honor, but I think that the predicates are unconvincing. I would, and largely, we've talked about this before, David, I would be very interested, by the way, parenthetically, to see, perhaps you have engaged with Ray Brassier, because Ray Brassier's writing on eliminativism is the most sophisticated, powerful, and sort of shaking that I've read, and that actually introduced me to the whole paradigm. And one of the things that's interesting about his writing is that it seems to me that he is a kind of left, very rigorous eliminativist who sort of takes a lot of the writings of Metzinger and the Churchlands and so on, and I think is far more rigorous with their predicates than they are. I think he is actually much tougher minded. So when you read the Churchlands or you see some of their lectures and so on, they're incredibly fast and loose with their concepts. They talk a lot about belief. With that, what do they mean by belief? It changes its tenets. At one point, it's kind of equated with love in Paul Churchland, and then it changes elsewhere. They make claims about, I don't think they have a coherent idea of what folk psychology is. So they combine completely reasonable critiques of something we can call folk psychology, which is essentially your mind doesn't work the way you think it does, with this lunatic extrapolation that you only think you're thinking. And like, for example, at one point, Patricia Churchland says an aspect of folk psychology is that memory is a single unified phenomenon, and neuropsychology has taught us there are very many different memory systems. Like, that would make Freudianism eliminativist. I mean, the idea that, like, like, no one, you don't have to be an eliminativist to know that it's gibberish to think that that there's one memory system, or that memory works a certain way, and so on. All of this is just a sort of preamble to me saying that that this is why we're here, because this question, the ultimate question, even Brassier for me, and I say this cautiously because I think Brassier is formidably brilliant and I've really wrestled with his stuff. It feels to me like his ultimate critique of the whole of phenomenology is that phenomenology essentially collapses the intuition that one is having an experience with an explanation of that experience. And I don't think that follows. All you need to accept is that there is a facticity to the fact that one is conscious. You don't need to have any claims at all about understanding it, or about the mechanisms underlying it, or so on, to recognize that for me is an insoluble problem for metaphysical materialism all the way down. And there were several weeks when I was wrestling with this, when I felt a bit like C.S. Lewis when he'd convinced himself of Christianity. I was like, miserably liberated. And where we go from here, I have no idea.
Oh, well. Go ahead, yeah.
Can I say, I mean, just as a counterpoint to your charitable reading, China, I think that, yes, people don't have to think about this stuff on a day-to-day basis. You don't need metaphysics on a picket line, as you can imagine a certain caricatured Trotskyist, wizened Trotskyist activist telling you. And it certainly wouldn't have made any difference to recent strike settlements that we've seen in the UK. Fine. Okay. But I think that in reality, when you're facing an existential crisis for the future of the planet, the nature of stuff and the nature of consciousness abruptly becomes very important. Like, for example, we recently got the news that the emperor penguin is now critically endangered for the first time. And, the reasons are not mysterious. It's the melting that's destroying the possibility of their habitat. And I keep coming up against the question, why do you matter? Why do you care? Why does it matter? Because... And, a short and obvious answer is because we're not sociopaths, but that doesn't really answer the question. And, a lot of the literature is vaguely, instrumentalist in its approach. Well, it's not very good for humans if all these animals disappear, or vaguely aesthetic in the approach. Well, penguins are lovely and polar bears are lovely and we don't want to lose them. They enrich our experience. And yes, that's true. That's definitely true. And definitely, I take the sort of basically Freudian view that in sort of consciousness terms, we contain multitudes, the sort of objects that we internalize. And no question about that. But if we are talking about, the particular beauty of penguins, it seems to me to consist largely in they're comprising a unique form of sentience that will never ever again be seen or repeated if they disappear. And that's it's a mysterious thing that we don't have any direct access to, but you do wonder, what is it like to hunt for fish and plankton and so on? What's it like for those penguins to mate and play hen and cock and all the rest of it? These are things that should be thrilling and exhilarating, and that requires a certain openness to the mystery of consciousness and to the mystery of being per se. And so I think it becomes politically derelict to set aside these questions at this point. And also, I think really what people are afraid of is what you'll let in. Once you say, well, we don't have a materialist explanation for consciousness. I mean, I will tell you, David, that since a couple of articles that I've written questioning the parameters of historical materialism's commitment to materialism and putting some limits thereon, most of the responses have been pretty positive. It's got more traction than I expected. That's great. But the kinds of people who are worried, well, are you going to start doing, chakras readings in the name of the class struggle? Is letting in some silly nonsense? You're going to start talking about extracorporeal experiences in order to expedite the revolution. That is something that I might end up writing about vaguely for some reason, but no. The worry is that you'll let in all the old bourgeois superstition and claptrap. As if, in fact, the bourgeoisie today was not as brutally reductive in its materialism.
I was about to say, the resistance to all of that supposed claptrap is one of the great bourgeois reactions of the modern age. I mean, 19th century rationalism, not the Enlightenment version, which itself was in many ways a formidably bourgeois phenomenon. The 19th century skepticism and rationalism went wonderfully hand in hand, not only with a kind of neo-Darwinian, or what would emerge as the neo-Darwinian orthodoxy, but a sort of Darwinian interpretation of human society and culture, but the entire the entire notion of rational economics and all of life is business. But I mean, I mean, what you're saying, of course, is music to my soul. I mean, I encourage people of whatever background, politically speaking, but to me, it seems a necessary sort of thing is to read up seriously on animal cognition, plant cognition. The reason for this, on the one hand, is just to cultivate a degree of sympathy. To realize that you're dealing with these extraordinary, billions of mysteries that have a beauty and a dignity to them that can't be replaced once they're gone. The extraordinary sensitivity and adaptability of, say, the mind of an octopus is a wonder to behold. And the more you investigate it, the more you realize, that you're bound not only by your own experience, but by the disjunction between your experience and whatever it is, whatever mystery lies on the other side of that being. That is it's a communion.
Can I come? Oh, I'm so sorry, David. I didn't mean to interrupt you. You'd spurred a thought. Please carry on.
Well, I was just going to say that I want to encourage people to think more intelligently about consciousness, because I want them to realize that consciousness isn't simply an electrochemical event that's situated in your skull, that it is actually, talk about mystical claptrap. It is a communion. I mean, you're part of a community of conscious beings who are together immersed in this mystery, who relate to one another within the medium of consciousness, and whatever it is that binds us morally to the world can't be separated from this mystery without ultimately reducing it just to an arbitrary choice based on personal preference. And that's an incredibly feeble ground for any kind of moral agency. But anyway, I'm sorry, China, you were...
It's just just one very tiny thing about what you were saying about what else you're going to let in and the dangers of bourgeois claptrap, Richard. This brings to mind my favorite quote from David Gascoigne, the poet. The soul is said by some to be a bourgeois luxury, which shows a strange misunderstanding both of soul and bourgeoisie.
That's great.
But this thing that you mentioned about animals, David, is really fascinating to me, because I have like I need to stress I was not aware of this at the time, but as a post factum sort of reconstruction of how I've ended up here in terms of this whole questioning. Over the last 10 years, the question of animal pathos and animal cognition, animal consciousness, interactions between humans and animals, but frankly, quite specifically, animal pathos has been more and more powerful and problematic to me. And I mean problematic in a good way. Like, the problem of animal pain has become fascinating to me. And as you doubtless know, in the kind of traditional socialist movement, there's a certain embarrassment about caring too much about animals. I mean, everyone loves their cats and dogs, etc. But Rosa Luxemburg's, towering figure of us Reds, and her letters in which she describes the pain she sees in cows and horses' eyes are slightly sort of brushed away as a bit embarrassing. And when she says something about, he who crushes a worm, I can't remember exactly the formulation, but is committing a great crime. The best you're allowed, particularly for the cows thing, is a kind of indulgent chuckle. And there is this sense, I think, that like when when we see images such as the one that went viral, I mean, there's all kinds of horrible images going viral, but the one of illegal loggers in the Amazon and a particular monkey literally sort of trying to stop one of the loggers coming for the tree. I mean, even thinking about it now makes me feel like I'm choking up. And I think to the extent that the traditional socialist movement would want to talk about that kind of reaction at all, and mostly it wouldn't, it might hem and haw and say something about bourgeois sentimentality getting in the way of real pain. No one is pro animal pain, but the real problem is the bourgeois treatment of the proletarians, etc., etc. Now, to be clear for my scandalized comrades out there, I in no way minimize the problem of proletarian and indeed human pain and tragedy and oppression and so on. And that's still, as someone who is ongoingly an activist, that is an irreducible and ultimate evil. But I began over the last 10 years, I think, to start to wonder whether, what if the pain I feel at seeing animal pain is philosophically important? And all it was that question, and a sort of slow discovery that my almost lifelong vegetarianism was not, in fact, mere habit, as I had told myself for about 20 years, but actually had an ethics underneath it. And underneath that ethics was a morality. And it was a morality I had been cordially ignoring for many years. And by the back door, the ceasing to ignore that, while at the same time consciously engaging with your work and questions of consciousness and morality and so on, to my sort of delighted surprise, have started to meet in the middle.
I'm glad to hear you say it. Yeah, I have to say and point out, just to exculpate the sort of socialist tradition there to some degree, is that this has been a problem of the whole Western tradition, religious and secular alike. I mean, there's no school of thought I get along with less well, for instance, in the Christian world than, say, Thomism. By which I mean a school of thought that's based on Thomas, not necessarily Thomas himself. But I'm not a great fan of Thomas either, to be honest. Once you get past certain metaphysical aspects of his thought, which he was brilliant. But yeah, I mean, the Thomists are remarkable. They take a kind of pride in their callousness towards the rest of creation, and they've there's a long tradition in the West of making this rather specious distinction between the rational soul and all other kinds of sentient life in a way that many other traditions are far superior to us, dharmic traditions, indigenous, what have you. But I mean, so it's not just a sickness. In a sense, the Western socialist tradition inherits that from centuries of defective thinking, as far as I can But it is, to me, a matter of the profoundest moment. I think, I don't know how to appeal to those who don't naturally want to think about the crisis, the ecological crisis of our time. They tend to think of it in such anthropocentric terms as the question is, will it be sustainable? And there simply has to be, first of all, that's an inadequate, sustainable for how long? But sustainability means the degree to which we can, quite often means the degree to which we can preserve a life of material comfort on our terms while not destroying the material basis of that. It's not the more radical sense of the moral and spiritual continuity of life that actually makes us, it's responsible to other beings that are suffering. We may create a sustainable system in which 70% of the species of the world that are still left have been extinguished. Probably not. I mean, there comes a level where the entire ecosystem collapses, but nonetheless, we're willing, and that's just simply not enough. The moment we're in, either, as I say, I have a certain sense that a kind of new romanticism has to be, or for want of a better word, has to underlie the sensibility of a politics that might actually get us past the material crisis of the present moment. And I know also that not cultivating this sympathy in ourselves, not cultivating this sense of the mystery of the consciousness and the suffering of other beings, ultimately, is itself a way finally to rationalize. I mean, to be honest, sooner or later, the threshold below which we don't give a damn is going to, constantly be raised even into, and it makes perfect sense that you end up, in the 20th century especially, beginning to think in terms of, clades of the human family that are more dispensable than others. It's just that there seems to be a necessary integrity to moral intelligence. Either you care at large, or you're simply trying to decide where the line of accommodation is to be drawn, and it always turns out to be a fluid boundary. And that's only one consideration. But yeah, no, I'm quite serious about this. I mean, I think that it's the people who want to be politically intelligent should immerse themselves in the literature of animal cognition. And again, even a vegetable cognition. What you discover is not only is there a mystery of consciousness that it's kind of barbaric. I don't quite share your admiration for Ray Brassier. I think he is better than the Churchlands. I think he comes out of a more a better tradition of thinking in synthetic terms. The Churchlands are very much creatures of the analytic tradition. So, and that's a tradition that teaches you to break up whatever it is literally analytic. It is dissolving the object under investigation into its mereological symbols in the hope that somehow that's adequate explanation of the phenomenon as a whole. And Brassier doesn't fall into that trap, but I think he still ends up making catastrophic mistakes about what is rationally entailed in his arguments. Putting all that aside, is that I think ultimately, well, for instance, the book on consciousness I'm writing now isn't really just on consciousness. It's not just on mind. It's on mind, life, and language. And essential to the argument is that these are all, not only are they all irreducible, they're all the same irreducibility, that consciousness is so fundamental, mind is so fundamental to the structure of reality, that at the moment you remove it from your calculations, you're already engaged in the work of the mechanization of human relationship, of relation to the world, the prudential use, reduction of the world to material reserves, the age of technology, to use Heidegger's language. So I think that, you know, I'm happy that you're thinking in these terms. I mean, I honestly believe that much of our hope for escaping the current predicament comes from taking animals as our serious moral, as not only a moral obligation, but as in a sense moral tuition.
I mean, in relation to how this sort of loops back into the question of style, it seems to me that well, there are many ethical obligations you could say with regard to style, but one of them, I think, is to re-enchant the world. I think that that is going to produce far better ethical motivations than the kinds of anxious shamelessness that is produced by this jittery, resentful kind of product that we get shoveled into us every day. So whether you're using the plain style naturalism, or whether you're writing Baroque and Rococo stylings, whatever, it should be about trying to induce a sense of wonder, that there is even something there, you know, it's something that it's so easy to be cynical about, because the world is quite brutal and nobody wants to be thought naive or sentimental. Nobody wants to be thought that they've been taken for a sucker. But that's where I think there's a beautiful book about transcendentalism in the 19th century. Whatever we think of that doctrine, it summoned a lot of support, black and white, in support of abolitionism, anti-slavery struggle, and it provided some of the ethical motivation behind it. And the author of this book says the problem is that we've been overtaken entirely by the negative side of critique. In other words, we've forgotten that there's something in aid of which you're conducting the critique. And so to be enchanted by birds, you know, I'm a sort of hobbyist bird photographer. This is something I enjoy, but also just generally in nature, the stuff of the world, and also other people. You know, not to be so frightened of other people that you turn to robots, but actually to come out with this mad, passionate curiosity about other people. That would be delightful. And I think if writing can help people to experience what that might be like, to feel the insides of that, then there's some possible hope.
No, I mean, re-enchantment. I mean, I'm willing to take that instead of romanticism as the lead phrase. But yeah,
and this is, I mean, and I you know, I sound like I'm deliberately trying to be provocative, but this is why I, with all sincerity, consider Harvard style political dereliction and reaction, because among the things it does is it attempts to it is an ideological form that says, here I am mathematizing and mechanizing thought and language for the transmission of information, as if that is what thought does, as if that is what language does, as if it's what writing does, as if it's what scholarship does. It's a disgusting thing. And what it's saying, because I think that language is one of the best ways we can re-enchant. And if you've got young scholars being trained that the way you do scholarship is to sort of brutally interrupt the enchanting aspects of the rhythms of language, like then what kind of message are you implying about thought?
Well, you know, in that long article I wrote on writing English prose, which, you know, there's a lot of comic material in there. But the bit about language being magic wasn't meant to be just obscurantist or sort of new agey in any
No,
sense.
sure.
Is that the moment consciousness emerges into a hermeneutical level of reality, a semiotic level, we're not just talking about communication. We're talking about a level of communion that, and it's not contemptible to talk about these things. You know, it's not irrational and it's not bourgeois to say that when we're talking about language, we're talking about a disclosure to one another and the world about us, of the self that each of us is to one another. That enchanted language is the simply, recognizing the value of the enchantment of which language is capable, which also has its dark side, the sort of seductive power of language to overwhelm reason and moral intelligence. Obviously, that's the dark side of it. But that actually it's a recognition of what language is and how it binds us to one another in community and binds us to the world and allows the world to speak through us of itself. I mean, there is a, in again, Christian tradition, there is this notion of human, the sort of non-Thomist way of looking things from Maximus the Confessor, from the Eastern tradition, especially, in which humanity has a kind of, well, don't want to use a provocative term here, but a priestly function here, in which as a creature with a special kind of relationship to logos, to language, nonetheless speaks for all of creation and brings into creation a kind of spiritual dimension that it shares and mediates to the whole. To say this is not Thomism. I mean, the uses of enchantment. I mean, this I think is a matter of should be a matter of serious conversation in the political realm. The understanding that the re-enchantment of the world, in a sense, I mean, this is the great project of modernity. I mean, you think about this. I mean, what we talk about as rational or Enlightenment rationality quite often just means learning to see the world as an economy of material resources to be exploited. And not to acknowledge that, that this is also implicit in the project of modernity, seems to me sheer folly, because then left and right become complicit in the same reductivism with ultimately, if not the same, at least analogously catastrophic results. And I do think that I don't know how you cultivate enchantment in an age of sheer spectacle, the society of the spectacle, which is accelerated to, so exponentially in the virtual age. But to me, it's the same. I'm not presuming that each of you has read all 20 of my published books or whatever the number is. But I was asked recently what, to my mind, was the most morally and politically serious thing I'd published. And I said it was Roland and Moonlight.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've both read that one. I can tell you because we've discussed it.
Okay, well, but I meant that. I mean, I don't expect people to embrace my vision of reality in its totality, as good as I think that would be for them. Or I do expect them to embrace Roland's. I mean, I've learned a lot from it. But I meant that. I mean, seriously, that book is very much for me a cri de coeur. It's learning to see that the mystery of the world is what binds us to the world, I think, is an imperative of our age, and one that becomes ever more elusive.
I agree with every word. And as you know, after I think after I did the essay on towards an apophatic Marxism, had a very interesting and comradely debate with some people who are much more sort of much more, I guess, in a much less conflicted way, come out of the radical Enlightenment tradition than I do. I would see myself as a sort of conflicted child of that tradition. And one of the things that they do and that they see, this is Fluss and Frim, who are interesting writers, but one of the things they do is, I think that they can, and I think they represent an enormous tradition of the left here, conflate mystery and mystification. And it's such a simple thing, and Catherine Keller has been quite useful for me making this distinction in some of her writing. I found that quite liberating. And the funny thing is, if one sort of talks about the connection between the metaphysics and enchantment, that does actually funnily lead us, among other things, and by a circuitous route, right back to this question of style, as you say, Richard.
As Richard said, yeah.
Yeah, because language is one of the primary tools we have, both for re-enchantment, but also for explication. And the point about mystery as opposed to mystification is that expressing a mystery with care is both re-enchantment and explication. And one of the things that, to bring in Brassier again, when Brassier is criticizing phenomenology, and I'm well aware that a Brassierite or an object-oriented ontologist is going to say I'm simply falling into the correlationist fallacy here, but one of the reasons he criticizes it is because he says many phenomenologists have concluded that only figurative and or poetic language can be truly adequate to the non-propositional dimension of meaningfulness, and phenomenology petitions figurative language in order to carry out its descriptive task. And that, for him, is almost an ipso facto expression of what's wrong with it, and why it is inadequate. But if you have a sense of figurative language as about mystery rather than mystification, let alone obfuscation, it does that job of explication, of pointing to something in the world, of explaining the world better than any arithmetic formula ever can, while also, hopefully, if done as best as it can be, enchanting.
Yeah. I mean,
the other thing is, if we don't undertake this task of re-enchantment, what you end up with is pseudo enchantments. There's quite a lot of them about people pursuing like mind-blowing stories about hidden realities, QAnon, 5G conspiracy theories. The whole appeal of this is the idea that you're being taken into the matrix, you're being shown the bare chassis of reality. It's a pseudo ecstasis. It doesn't really tell you anything about reality. It doesn't reveal anything to you. In fact, it is the definition of mystification, and quite a brutalizing, vulgarizing mystification as it goes, being bound up as it is with a kind of gamification of reality. But one of my favorite passages, that deals with enchantment, is precisely about getting to the root of matter. And this is Henry David Thoreau walking in the Maine woods up Mount Katahdin, coming down, getting lost, starved, and he says, I stand in awe of my body. This matter to which I am bound has become so strange to me. I fear not spirits, ghosts of which I am one, that my body might, but I fear bodies, I tremble to meet them. What is this Titan that has possession of me? Talk of mysteries. Think of our life in nature, daily to be shown matter, to come in contact with it. Rocks, trees, winds on our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, common sense, contact. Who are we? Where are we? I love this passage because precisely it turns the ordinary encounter with just the stuff of the world into something miraculous, which, of course, it is.
Well, you already mentioned American transcendentalism and what you said, what everyone thinks of that. Let me confess here that I am a thoroughgoing American transcendentalist sort. I have to admit that tons of Emerson and Thoreau in my thinking. So you're actually preaching to the choir here. I love that passage too, and in fact, I love that whole work. And you know, it might actually be a good place to stop. I don't know, because I think
I was just saying we've gone 2 hours, and
we've gone 2 hours.
My cat, who Richard summons, is asking me for food. So,
well, as I've said, the animal pathos should be chief among our moral concerns, and exactly. I have a dog that needs walking. I've very much enjoyed the conversation. I very much, especially enjoyed meeting Richard face to face, sort of. Pixels to pixels.
This has been fascinating. Thank you for hosting, David.
Yeah.
Oh, and thank you. And thank you. It was very, well, not just enjoyable, but in some sense, spiritually fortifying conversation, because I'm glad to know that just certain commonalities of imaginative and moral tendencies, and I admire you both greatly as writers. I've enjoyed and learned from so much, and of what you've written, and God bless you. and
you, and thank you, and I'm sure we'll have occasion to speak again, perhaps after our AI overlords ruin the world even more.
Yeah. Although they may then not allow us to use this technology to do so, we may have to meet in a cave outside of some nameless city.
I'm in.
Okay. Well,
cheers, David.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.